immigrants that live in European cities have a stake in the question of climate change impacts in the city, but also have something to say about it in terms of their experience, their knowledge, their proposals, their ideas of how to move towards more adapted cities and also how to mitigate these problems of climate change and of the impacts on health. Because usually when we talk about migration and climate change, that sort of nexus has been mostly studied with regards to how climate pushes people to leave a place because the impacts of climate change are so severe that they need to escape them. But we haven't really looked at how people confront or how people experience climate change after they have migrated, especially racialized people coming from countries of the global south to countries of the global north.
Globally, we're witnessing the sacrifice of people and places due to the effects of the climate crisis and climate injustice. We see the uneven and unequal vulnerabilities and marginalization of deaths and devastation taken for granted. We see continuities from the past reverb into the future through acts of slow and at many points abrupt violence. This year, in 2024, news reports tell us of nightmare nighttime temperatures in Delhi as high as 35 degrees Celsius, one of the hottest nights India's capital has seen in decades. In Greece, temperatures reached 44.5 degrees Celsius, prompting the closure of schools and historical sites. In places like Egypt, heat is proving fatal and aggravating already perilous situations for refugees from Sudan who seek to cross the border into Egypt. In Western Europe, the consequences of climate breakdown are unfurling, particularly in the form of heat waves, as the continent's temperatures are warming twice as fast as the global average. Extreme heat killed more than 47,000 people in Europe during 2023. As on the global scale, income level has the strongest association with the impact of heat on daily mortality. Heat injustice is entangled with disability injustice, racial justice, labour justice, housing justice, and in many cases differentially experienced along lines of age, gender, and class. Urban areas with their dense buildings, paved streets, everywhere concrete and motorised traffic, absorb and generate a lot of heat. In Madrid, nighttime temperatures can stay above 20 or 25 degrees Celsius.
Urban heat justice is a topic that traverses both how people experience and suffer from heat, especially in the context of the burgeoning climate crisis and its impacts on cities around the world. Heat injustice is also entangled with the topic of urban ecologies and so-called climate refuges. These can take the form of public places with access to air conditioning, which is otherwise for many an unaffordable luxury in the domestic home, drinking water, shade, or importantly, access to green spaces, which offer cooler temperatures naturally and can offer a respite from the otherwise stifling and desiccating temperatures in cities. There are, however, stark inequities around who gets to seek sanctuary in green spaces, as parks, tree cover and plant-filled places are entrenched with inequalities around the distribution, neoliberal exclusion, or displacement of people in their creation. Ecologies of cities are, therefore, starkly political. In that vein, our guest today is Panagiota Kotsila, who works at the Barcelona Lab for Environmental Justice and Sustainability. Panagiota has been researching urban ecosocial justice for many years now. Today's episode leads us to reconsider the relations between city residents,
Heat injustice,
and the urban ecologies in which they are part.
Now I hand it straight over to Panagiota to introduce herself and how they came to dedicate themselves to the struggle around
urban ecosocial justice.
My name is Panagiota Kotsila, and yes, I'm a researcher at the Barcelona Lab, which is a research group within ICTA, the Institute for Environmental and Technology Studies at the Autonomous University of Barcelona, where I'm based. I am a biologist by training. I moved into environmental management and soon after got more involved into questions of political ecology, which brought me now to be studying more questions around urban ecosocial justice. Can you tell us a little bit about what the center is? So what's the Barcelona Lab? Well, the lab, as I said, is a research group. It's a recognized research group here in Catalonia. It began with Isabel Angelovski's project on green gentrification, basically, but it became this bigger thing where we brought together researchers generally interested in questions of urban sustainability, and not only greening, also climate adaptation, also questions around commoning, around degrowth, around broader questions of, let's say, social natures or nature cultures, and how is this expressed in the urban environment. Also, a lot of people work on questions around health. So what are the impacts on people's health of different urban planning initiatives, of greening, of climate change, these kinds of things. So we are a number of researchers that the actual number and people change over the years, but basically what brings us and draws us together is this commitment to do socially relevant research around questions of justice and work with a lot of the research that we do comes from and is taking place with movements on the ground.
That's brilliant. Thank you. And so I wondered if we can also talk a bit about the new book that you have been part of writing called Insurgent Ecologies, Between Environmental Struggles and Post-Capitalist Transformations, which is edited by the Undisciplined Environments Collective. So I wondered if you could firstly talk a bit about Undisciplined Environments Collective, which you're a founding member of, and also about the chapter that you co-authored.
Yeah, so Undisciplined Environments is another collective that I'm part of, which is less institutionalized, let's say. So that's we're a collective of people that were brought together initially by a European ITN network, which is basically a funded network of scholars around the world that are working on similar topics. What brought us together was the broader field of political ecology. And some of us maintained contact throughout the years and decided we wanted to create a platform where our reflections and the outcomes of research within the field of political ecology could become more accessible to a broader public on the one hand, and also make it a bit more timely, a bit more alive. So like to have, comments on issues that are happening right now by political ecologists or other people, in the broader critical human geography or environmental humanities, having them debate and comment on issues that we see evolving right now in the world. And that's how we started this online platform, which is now called Undisciplined Environments, and bring activists to discuss with us and write with us on different themes. And this is the result. This is basically where the book's idea came from. It's a book that will be out this October, and it's published by Fernwood Publishing. It's an independent press in Canada. And the book basically brings together stories about how environmental and social movements around the world can converge into a broader struggle, right? So it's like what can we learn from different movements and different geographies in order to learn from each other, but also learn in the process of writing. As I said, each chapter, at least one of the authors is an activist in the place where we are writing from. My contribution here, apart from editorial and writing a bit on the theoretical premises of each of its sections, has been an empirical chapter with my PhD student on how greening in Tbilisi, which is a city in Georgia, acted as an arena to exclude LGBTQ plus minorities and sex workers from using that space, that kind of urban nature. And we are learning through Tornike, who's my co-author and also an activist in Tbilisi, in the city that we're writing from. We're learning with them on what were their tactics of resistance. How did they manage to resist that kind of neoliberal and exclusive urban intervention? What have they achieved and what challenges they faced? So it's, this is what the chapter is about.
Yeah, thank you so much for outlining that. And I'm really happy to be able to promote the book in some way on this podcast as well. And I can also in the show notes add the specific chapter title and everything. So you've worked a lot on the topics of health, cities and climate justice. And I recently came across a different book. Actually, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. It's called Inflamed, Deep Medicine and the Anatomy of Justice by Raj Patel and Rupal Maria.
Yes.
Which examines the ways in which health disparities are connected to colonialism, politics and capitalism, and calls to thinking about health not only as an individualistic matter, but a collective endeavor. And I feel like your work in many ways speaks to this as well. And in particular, you've written in the past that a critical analysis of immigrants' climate health vulnerability in the European context is largely missing. And you focus on Europe mainly in your words, and I'm going to quote you now, because Europe has been has been a locus of international migration and of neocolonial politics of migration, which causes exclusion, economic exploitation, and subjection to violent border technologies and cultural racism. So I wondered if you could explain the ways in which health and ecology in European cities can and should be analysed through the lens of coloniality and maybe collective forms of well-being and the diverse health needs and climate health vulnerabilities of immigrant people.
Well, where to begin? First of all, just recognizing that the immigrants that live in European cities are people that also and majorly are affected by climate change. And so, should be considered in what we might be imagining as, climate citizenship, the people that have a stake, in the question of climate change impacts in the city, but also that have something to say about it in terms of their experience, their knowledge, their proposals, their ideas of how to move towards more adapted cities, and also how to mitigate these problems of climate change and of the impacts on health. On the one hand, then is just the mere recognition of the existence of people that are not European citizens formally, right? They don't own a European passport, but they do live, they inhabit, and they make European cities.
Mm-hmm.
They're central to the making and the functioning of European cities, and should be recognized as politically equally citizens in that sense, including climate citizens. Because usually when we talk about migration and climate change, that sort of nexus has been mostly studied with regards to how climate pushes people to migrate, to leave a place, because the impacts of climate change are so severe that they need to escape them. But we haven't really looked at how people confront or how people experience climate change after they have migrated, especially racialized people coming from countries of the global south to countries of the global north. And also we've usually seen, migrants as people who need things, who need support, who need resources, etc., which is largely true, but we haven't really seen migration and migrants as people also who carry unique and valuable knowledge, and how that knowledge can be mobilized, can be used not only to the benefit of the city or of urban societies, but also for the purpose of emancipation of migrant communities, especially. So coming back to your question about health and how we can study health through a decolonial or post-colonial lens, I think there are many layers, many facets of how this could be done, beginning from what I just explained, the recognition of these subjects and considering them as equal knowledge holders, as equal citizens in the climate question. Also, when it comes to health, I think there's a lot there to be explored with regards to different knowledges around health, different ways of understanding health beyond the Western biomedical gaze, let's say, and different ways of understanding health as a social outcome. Like you said, the social determinants of health, which especially for racialized groups cannot be seen independently of colonial pasts and of coloniality the way it is experienced today in European cities particularly. So this leads us to look at structural issues like the historical segregation of communities, for example, in American cities based on race. Here in Europe, you can see the same with immigrant communities, especially working class people or people of no income who work informal, precarious jobs. What does this mean in terms of health impacts, in terms of climate health impacts specifically? So, for example, some research that we did here in Barcelona on heat and extreme temperatures and, more frequent heat waves that we are experiencing in the Mediterranean and Southern Europe more generally. When we see how institutions capture vulnerability to heat, most of them look at demographic factors like, age or maybe gender, sometimes income levels. But in general, we see that race or ethnicity or migration status does not enter as a disaggregated factor, demographic characteristic to see are people, that come from other countries affected differently by heat in the city. So we don't know that. We don't have the data for that. So when we go to see this empirically, just to talk to people directly in neighborhoods that are mostly inhabited by migrants, we see that not only do they live in flats that are less resilient to heat. That meaning that they don't have an air conditioning unit. If they have, they cannot afford to use it because of the energy costs. Apartments are very small because of the rent prices, because of the gentrification and touristification trends in a city like Barcelona. What people can afford is to live in apartments that have maybe only one window, so there's no air circulation. A lot of people staying in the same apartment, so I suppose crowding is an issue as well. And then you see how this is linked with the type of work, the type of labor that people that don't have a European passport are kind of pushed into, right? Because of their informality, which in turn comes because of the legislations that exist about when can a person legally work in a country if they are newcomers. So all of these things, immigration policies, urban planning policies, issues of rights to housing, all of these things kind of come and coalesce into the everyday experience of migrants, which is one, where they describe that at work, working in, let's say, restaurants, in kitchens with no air conditioning, with no ventilation, where they feel, that they might faint at any time in the summer, where at home, people that have to spend a lot of the time at home taking care of kids, especially women, or doing housework, consider their house being hell in the summer. Like, this is actually a quote from one of our participants in the research. So the home becomes a hostile environment. And so people have to go to the public space, right, to find relief from heat. And in the public space, you see the expressions of xenophobia and racism on a daily basis, because people that have a different skin color or that dress differently, that have a different cultural, let's say, cultural expressions in the way they dress, are being recognized as others. And so even in places like climate shelters, which are public spaces that can offer relief from heat or cold, but speaking about heat now, things like public libraries, civil centers, some public parks, and other places like that, these might be open and free for everybody in theory, but people with migrant background, especially racialized people, feel not welcome there. And this is what we've found in our research here in Barcelona, in the barrio of El Raval, is that either they don't know about them, they haven't been well informed, and if they do, they feel that these are places where they wouldn't go anyway, and they're not going to go if the weather is hot, because they don't feel it's places for them. They don't feel welcome there. So these are just some of the findings that show that, heat justice, heat justice is not just a question of how many trees or how many, air-conditioned places a city can have to offer to their citizens, but also, deeper issues of housing, of labor, of cultural inclusion, etc., play out in the city.
Yeah, thank you so much for unpacking that as well, because for me, it's also really important to understand this nexus between the ecologies of the city and justice, and what this actually looks like. The visceral, everyday materialities of this is really important to speak about. And I think about this topic a lot because in the UK, if we have warm spaces that are being made available in the winter times, as well as all of the things that you've just mentioned about accessibility and how marginalized people are able to or not feel like they can access these spaces, how we should be thinking about these spaces. Are they an adaptation to crisis? Are they a form of mutual aid, or are they a neoliberal expression of the state sort of offloading climate adaptation and survival onto the charity of public and private places that open their doors when they choose to people in the city? I mean, I know in some cases, some of these places in Madrid are even sponsored by banks like CaixaBank. And so anyway, I'm just wondering how you make sense of these places more from a theoretical understanding of them.
I mean, the types of climate shelters I was referring to here in Barcelona are mostly public, like just public places. There are some like museums or foundations that I suppose some private factor might be there, like public-private entities, but generally speaking, they're public spaces. I mean, my problem with these types of solutions, let's say, is that it's mostly about mitigating, the worst the worst type of outcome, like saying, okay, if you have nowhere to go, there's these places that you can get some relief from heat. So it's like it's not addressing any of the drivers of the vulnerability that people might have to heat. Is more addressing or avoiding the worst outcome, which is, going to the hospital with a heat stroke or having a heart attack because of the heat. So my point is that if we are looking for, on the one hand, this is problematic because, and like I said, and like we saw in practice, people are not going to go to places that are not familiar with or that they're not, they don't feel comfortable in. And if they go, they're only going to go if they really, really, really need to. So it's not going to be a place that they feel their own. So instead of starting from places that that policymakers imagine would be adequate for people to go to, we might want to look at the spaces that people, especially marginalized and the most vulnerable people, are already using. Like, what are the spaces, the community spaces that people are already going to? They have already created some sort of connection and community with those spaces. Because the other thing is, vulnerability to heat is also a very social issue in the sense that loneliness, living alone, being on your own is itself a factor of vulnerability. Being with other people that will make sure you're okay, that will bring you a glass of water if you need to, etc. This is something that can keep you well, not just the building having an air conditioning. So this social aspect of places where one could go to find relief. So apart from regulating temperature itself only, also looking at the social fabric that is created or maintained through those spaces. I think this is very important. So in the case of Raval, for example, we saw that an urban garden that was created by the community was a space that was preferred by some of the most marginalized collectives in the neighborhood because they felt it as their own. So why don't we look at those spaces and try to strengthen their existence, their usage, their functioning, and provide funds and support to make them even better? Instead of trying to create an extra park or trying to promote a museum as a heat shelter, or in parallel to that, that's one thing that needs to be more considered. I mean, I think the intentions of cities in general are good, but they're also avoiding the deeper questions, right? Why are some people more vulnerable to heat? Who is it that is more affected from heat? And why is that so, right? So if you have people working, delivering, for example, packages or food in the middle of the day, when it's the hottest hours of the day, in these precarious jobs like Amazon deliveries or the gig economy, more generally, that requires people running around in their bikes or motorcycles under the sun. Why is it that these jobs exist and these people are obliged to do them? Rather than saying, okay, if you feel too hot, come in here and we'll give you a glass of water, maybe address the bigger problems behind it, which is why do migrants, for example, which is mostly migrants, feel like they or are forced into these types of jobs? It is because these jobs don't, like in Spain, for example, there was this regulation since last year that employers should not make their workers, outdoors workers, work during the hottest time of the day. But in the gig economy, there's no employee. There's no employer. You're employing yourself. So this rule doesn't apply, right? Just an example. So supposedly you're protecting workers, but really there's so much informality and informal work that is happening that you can't protect people through these types of regulations. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. You've raised some really important points, especially what you were saying earlier, the material aid in the form of a building where people can seek shelter, plus the supplementary aspect of the immaterial fabric of a city and focusing more on the social, eco-social relationships, which is much harder often to cultivate and to nurture and to facilitate. But that is necessary work that needs to be done, but it's not easy. And that's actually what Future Natures we're super interested in, is these social relationships, this fabric you called it earlier, how we can find new ways or reclaim old ways of relating to one another and relating to the ecosystems in which we are part. And so I'm really grateful that you you articulated that in a really brilliant way. So again, we'll focus on the example of Spain, I guess. Wanted to talk about a bit about trees and the topic of greening, which I know that you've done quite a lot of work around. We've all felt the difference between when we walk into a park that's full of trees or green spaces in the shade, how much of a respite this provides us from the suffocating heat that we feel in cities covered in concrete and tarmac. And in some cases, in Madrid, the presence of trees can lower temperatures by up to 20 degrees Celsius. But rather than adding to and caring for nature's shade givers in cities, the Madrid City Council continues to cut them down to make space for private parking lots, amongst other exclusionary infrastructure. So this is quite an evident example of why ecology and social inequity are connected. The future ecologies of cities are obviously highly contested, and there are many visions colliding with one another, causing uneven and often exclusionary processes of development and so-called sustainability transitions. And you've written about in the past around things to do with green dispossession and accumulation, green exclusion and privilege, and also green gentrification and displacement. And so I wondered if you could talk a bit about the topic of urban greening and from your experiences, what you think are some crucial components for more justice-based transitions in urban spaces, maybe drawing on some examples in your work.
Yeah, so I can speak of the work I've done in cities, mostly in Europe, because there's different models of urbanization, right? Different ways that cities have been created, different types of natures and ecologies that they include in the world. And I don't think that I am able to speak of kind of global trends, but definitely there is a trend, there is a discourse around greening cities that is global, and we can say a so-called orthodoxy, right, of similar to sustainability or smart city. The green city is something that has become very kind of globally desired and considered good, like just it's good to be green, right? It's good for a city to be green because if you have cities that are completely gray, concrete and car dominated, this is harmful for people's health, and this is it's not resilient, it's not able to deal with the impacts of climate change, etc. But is green really always good? To what extent is greening and the narratives around greening in cities and urban planning a way maybe of greenwashing neoliberal capitalist projects for more urban growth, for more economic growth, and for consolidation of that growth and of profit in the hands of a few, privatizing land, privatizing public space in general. We've seen this happen in many, many cases in North America, in Europe and beyond, in South America, also in cities around the world, really, in different ways, obviously, but we do see this trend where greening becomes a sort of an excuse to increase or to build luxury housing or exclusive housing around which, greening happens, either before or after. So greening can cause so-called gentrification through the creation of new kind of luxury housing, or it could be part of new developments, like of urban regeneration, where real estate developers are kind of asked, or they do it themselves. They create new green spaces for these new residents, the new so-called sustainability or green class that will live in these new neighborhoods. So I think that we need to look at it really. We need to really look at greening in cities in the different ways that happens very critically, and not all types of green is the same. Not only from an ecological point of view, but also from a social point of view. So we have to look at what sort of benefit, what sort of relationships and benefits can be accrued from greening when we're introducing different types of ecologies, different types of natures in the city. Who are under what conditions this is governed? Who does it belong to? Who makes use of it? Who could make use of it? What are the long-term consequences of the introduction of this new greening? So on one hand side, you can't deny the benefits of it. You have shade, you have soil permeability, you have biodiversity benefits, you have, temperature regulation. This is all great. But when does this become in a way, the value of that is extracted or is appropriated by the privileged few. When does beautifying or improving neighborhoods lead to their gentrification eventually? Under what conditions? This mainly happens through an absence of policies that protect the right to housing, right? So when the prices of housing are not protected or rent prices are not regulated, when there's no policies to protect working class or lower income people continue to live in that neighborhood. And on the other hand, where greening happens in a non-participatory, kind of non-democratic way, where basically the decisions are taken with, growth and profit making in mind, and not really the well-being of the community in very broad strokes. So examples, there's so many examples that I don't know where to start. But I think it's interesting to see that it's not necessarily always the intention of a new park or a new, green corridor that a city might be promoting. Here in Barcelona, for example, we have the famous super blocks, which is an initiative of pacifying certain blocks in a neighborhood, limiting the circulation of cars and introducing new public space free of cars, but also new green areas, new play areas, etc. This initiative that has been brought forward by a progressive government that we had up to this year in the city faced a lot of contradiction, both from the left and from the right, let's say. On the one hand, the first implementation of that policy happened very fast. There was not enough consultation with people in the neighborhood, together with other processes that were happening in the neighborhood of Poblenou, which was one of accelerated regeneration of that neighborhood, the introduction of big buildings, call centers, hotels, things that the neighborhood was against in the first place. Also, with the creation of these new super blocks, did bring a sort of change, in the neighborhood that people didn't want to, including the increase of rental price and increase the desirability of the neighborhood in general. But then that policy, people in the city were open to feedback, and the next implementation of that in the neighborhood of San Antonio was done in a very different way, in a way protecting local business, the local little shops, that they making sure that the local economy and local society wouldn't suffer as much from this gentrification trend that such an intervention might bring, especially in a city like Barcelona, where also attracts, tons of tourists, and touristic apartments are also, one of the problems that causes the gentrification of neighborhoods. Why am I saying all this? Because the type of green and the way this is governed and the way this is also combined with other processes that happen in a neighborhood really matters. It's not the same if you have an urban garden in New York and an urban garden in the outskirts of Paris. It won't have the same impact socially, right? We've seen how even the most benign green intervention, which we might say is a community garden, has had gentrification effects in the context of New York. But in Barcelona, it hasn't. And in other places, I'm sure it hasn't either, where, the hype or the pressure for gentrification is not as high due to the context. So we need to look at green contextually always. It's not always the same, the types of impacts that it might have.
I think you've written about before, like this idea of trickle down greening kind of theory, or equally thinking about greening as something that's done in specific places and not thinking about the city as a whole kind of ecosystem. But I'm wondering if you also have some ideas around sort of radical adaptation of cities.
Generally speaking, when we talk about greening and how greening can be done in cities, including measures for climate adaptation, not just planting trees, the idea is that greening initiatives in cities should not only focus on environmental sustainability, more kind of narrowly speaking, but also social justice, right? Green spaces and environmental improvements should be empowering marginalized communities, should be promoting equity, should be addressing systemic inequalities through the way in which they are implemented. I mean, I think there's a bigger question here, which is, can institutions like city governments or regional governments, which have contributed in creating the conditions of oppression and othering, so to say, in urban societies and more broadly, can they be trusted to promote emancipation in that sense? Could we expect, that greening initiatives coming from state authorities be really promoting radical adaptation or emancipation through greening? This is a bigger question, of course. I think we can see that in cities, especially through certain municipalist movements and governments like we had here in Barcelona, where, there is decentralization of power from national to regional or local governments, cities, towns, and local communities. We see that there is greater and more direct involvement of citizens in governance and decision-making, and there is hope. It's really this interaction, this deep and long-term co-creation of knowledge around what is the problem that should be addressed and on knowledge on how to address it, where people intervene in moments of decision-making, for example, for an urban regeneration project, but also local governments are feeding from and paying attention to and support grassroots initiatives that already exist, right, that are coming from the bottom up, like community urban gardens, cultural centers, housing cooperatives, food cooperatives, etc. So it's this dialogue, this interaction between citizens and local governments that I think this brings me hope, and I've seen it bringing really good results. On the other hand, we've talked about greening in cities and climate change, but I think we should also be talking about, and this is an area that I haven't done direct research in, but I think is really interesting, is how do we deal with processes of urbanization and deurbanization in order to avoid causing more damage, right, environmentally and socially? So this is a question that relates to things like the abandonment of the countryside due to the industrialization of agriculture, for example, global food chains that are putting pressure on local producers and local systems of production, huge questions of justice and human rights for the migrant workers that are mostly working the land in Europe today, and so on. So how we transform not only cities, but also how do we change the process of urbanization in general? Because it's sort of, I feel like it's taken for granted that, most people now live in cities. Most people are going to be living in cities in the future. Like, we've kind of abandoned the question of the countryside or the rural a little bit. And I think if we're going to talk about socio-ecological justice in the future, we need to revisit that question and not take for granted that everybody will be just living in cities in the future.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought that up, because that's actually something that I think about a lot, trying to wrangle with this seemingly hard-lined divide, right? Like between the rural and the urban. And for me, this binary, it doesn't sit well with me. And so maybe we can do a part 2 of this at some point and delve into that. But it brings me on to my very last question, which is about knowledge holders and transforming living conditions in the city. Because you've proposed in the past, and I'm going to quote you again, if we are to address the social exclusion, inequalities, and disproportionate exposure to health risks that immigrants often face, immigrants should be treated as equal knowledge holders with experience, expertise, and situated knowledges who can offer crucial insight when it comes to reconceptualizing and planning for healthy and just cities, life, immigration, and knowledge production. So I just wondered if you could unpack this a bit and explain how the co-creation of knowledge can help transform cities as infrastructure, as planning, as services, not as something that's done to us, so to speak, but something that we have active participation in, and to meet our different needs.
See, knowledge co-creation, I think, has been used in many different ways, and some of them deeply problematic, I think. So I've seen it being used to describe processes where privileged people from different professions or fields come together to discuss a topic, right? That could be interesting, but it has little to do with justice. So knowledge co-creation also has been often used to describe, broadly speaking, participatory processes where people are invited in certain settings at certain times and with a certain agenda to give their opinion on an issue. This can also be deeply problematic because in many times we've seen that in such processes, the opinions of people are asked for in aspects of a project which is already otherwise decided upon. So it's like only at the very end of a broader, more core decision has been already taken from, let's say, the important people, right? And then communities or residents are called to give their opinion about fine-tuning some details of that project, say the planning of a new park or a new real estate development or, I don't know, some change in the neighborhood. And even worse, a lot of knowledge co-creation, so-called co-creation processes don't end up taking the outcomes of that process and really turning them into something tangible, into something material. A lot of the times it just stays in the in the discursive sphere. We collected those opinions, we're considering them, but the end result is this. So here the question I'm proposing from the work that you cited is just how we can bring people together to share opinions on climate adaptation, but really how can we research the ways in which people understand and experience climate change in their everyday lives. So I'm talking about more long-term process of understanding how people carry knowledge, embody knowledge around climate change because of, especially speaking about immigrants, because of where they come from, they might have different knowledge around the impacts of climate change and how to confront it or how to adapt to it, but also because of the fact that they have lived the migration experience and are usually the ones exposed to the worst impacts of climate change at the places where they migrate to. They might also know better what can be a form of more just and effective adaptation rather than adaptation measures that end up being maladapted for them, right? Like having the opposite result in terms of well-being for the vulnerable communities in which many migrant collectives belong to. So this whole thinking comes from a long line of feminist scholarship that is arguing for a focus on the everyday and embodied knowledges of people on the ground, and especially from marginalized communities and racialized communities. The claim here is that knowledge on any issue cannot be disembodied, right? We cannot speak of impacts of climate to urban residents if we don't talk to those urban residents, or we can't talk about vulnerability to climate change if we don't talk to the people who have been brought into this condition of vulnerability. Vulnerability not being something, fixed or a label for some certain people or places, but rather a shifting condition to which people are subjected to because of the multiple oppressions that they are facing. So from an intersectional lens as well, understanding then what is the experience that people are having of climate change as it interacts with other things that are happening, right? The climate change is often only, let's say, this extra pressure, that exacerbates or makes more visible inequalities that already existed and difficulties or challenges that people have been already facing. So when I talk about knowledge co-creation and how can we make adaptation more radical, what I mean is how can we really go to the root of the problem that people are facing in their everyday lives, which are problems which are exacerbated by climate change or changed or different types of problems that arise because of climate change, and really understand it in relation to processes, historical and contemporary processes of exclusion, of oppression, of racism, of coloniality, etc.
I'm really inspired by your work, and we've touched on some really important areas of. I just wondered if there was anything else that you either wanted to say or any other work, if people have an interest in looking to maybe some organizations or other the ongoing projects that are happening around the topics of health, cities, immigration, climate justice, or even this topic around the rural and rethinking the future of cities.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for engaging with my work in such detail. If people want to look up more around issues of environmental and climate justice in the city, the BCNUEJ website has a lot of sections with resources and interactive audiovisual material like mini documentaries. So people go visit them. There's the voices of activists from many different contexts around the world there that you can listen to firsthand. Otherwise, I'm beginning this project called Embrace in September, which is focusing exactly on this question of migrant communities, climate, health impacts, and just adaptation. And I will be posting news around how that research goes, we're going to be doing research in 6 different cities in Europe. So we've got Berlin, Antwerp, we've got Barcelona, Athens, Dublin, and Marseille. So I'm looking forward to start that and share some of the outcomes of that project as well.
You've been listening to an episode of the Future Natures podcast. We've been talking to Panagiota Kotsila. You can find links and details of any references made in our conversation with Panagiota in the show notes, including links to the social media for the Barcelona Lab for Urban Environmental Justice and Sustainability, any books, papers, research projects and organisations that we made reference to in this conversation. Thanks for listening. Until next time.